Hello, this is a much belated continuation of a series of recordings I started ages ago on the subject of the early Irish alphabet, the Ogham or Ogham if you prefer to pronounce it. You can pronounce it either way. My intent earlier was to make a recording, go through each letter and explain the symbolism, the meanings, the poetic kennings and so forth. And I got so far, and then life happened and I lost track of it. So this is picking up again from the 9th letter, the letter Coll, which represents the hazel tree. Now, as the 9th letter of the alphabet, the number 9 itself has quite a lot of symbolism within Irish, Welsh and other Celtic sources. It's a subject I'm surprised there hasn't been books on so far. Actually, well, at least I don't think there's been any books on numerological imagery in Celtic mythology and sources, at any rate. Maybe a gap in the market there. But to give you just a few samples, in poetry from the Highlands of Scotland and Irish sources and so on, there is talk of the 9 elements. Now, obviously, within Greek myth, and much more widely known, is talk of 4 elements: earth, air, fire and water. That's a recurrent image not only in Greek mythology but throughout Western Europe, as Greek culture sort of spread its influence across. Many other cultures started to echo the idea of there being 4 elements. In China they have 5 elements, including metal as one of them. Within the various Celtic sources, often primarily Gaelic poetry that I'm thinking of offhand, the exact set of 9 does vary. So it's not a consistent set of 9, the same 9, found in poem after poem after poem. Rather, it's variants on a theme. Some of them do recur a lot. Others are changeable from one poem to the next. And as well as just earth, air, fire and water, there is an element of that coming into it. So things like power of lightning, power of sun, power of moon, power of rock, and so forth is spoken about. So in its naturalistic elements, things that occur wandering in the Irish or the Scottish or wherever countryside, you'd see rocks, you'd see rivers, you'd feel the wind blowing on your skin, you'd see thunder and lightning in the sky sometimes. So it's the kind of things that people were familiar with around them as a set of 9 elements. Now, within Western magical practice, ceremonial magic, Wicca, various other traditions, it's common practice to cast a magical circle and to call upon the 4 elements associated with each of the 4 quarters. I'm not aware of any evidence of people in early Irish, Welsh, Scottish, etc. sources casting circles using 9 elements. I mean, certainly there is the habit of creating circles, often by circumambulation, walking around a sacred stone or a sacred tree or whatever it was, perhaps walking around 9 times in some occasions. That does crop up, but they're not necessarily stopping at certain junctures to call upon. Right, let's call upon the power of lightning, let's call upon the power of the sky, let's call upon the power of the sea. They're not necessarily doing that as they go around, in the same way that a Wiccan would stop at certain junctures, cardinal points around their magic circle, and call upon air, call upon fire, etc., etc. So it doesn't necessarily have a direct parallel in Celtic sources to the kind of practices found within ceremonial magic, or at least not a recorded source that I'm aware of. It could be because I'm just not come across that source yet, and then maybe there is one, I just haven't read it. Or it could be that the kinds of practices engaged in were not committed to writing, or if they were, possibly more censorious forces decided to get rid of those written sources as being tempting people into magic and being ungodly or whatever, and there was a degree of censorship, possibly, I don't know, or maybe they just didn't do that in the first place. They had their ritualistic numbers, they had their circle walking, but they didn't make a direct link between walking in circles and a set of 9 elements, perhaps. It would be relatively easy to divide a circle into 8 junctions and have the centre as the 9th presence. Perhaps could be done. But anyway, just leave that floating there as a possibility. In Welsh tradition, there is the story of Morgan le Fay, who features heavily in Arthurian tales, sometimes as King Arthur's half-sister, sometimes as an aunt. Occasionally she crops up in different contexts, often confused with Morgause, another figure in Welsh myth, Arthurian myth. But in one version she resides in the Isle of Avalon with a sisterhood of 9. Now, she may be the 9th and there's 8 other sisters, or sometimes there is a sisterhood of 9 and she goes to join them. It depends on the rendition of the myth. But the notion of a sisterhood consisting of 9 women crops up there. Arianrhod resides in a community. I was going to say commune, it could be a commune or community of women, rather like nuns or priestesses, who live on an island and discourage men from stepping foot on the island. It's not forbidden the way it is in some traditions, because Gwydion and Llai arrive there in disguise as cobblers selling their wares, selling their shoes, and they're allowed to get onto the harbour area where they berth their boat in order to measure up the women's feet to provide them with new shoes. So they do allow men on to some extent, but obviously it's considered primarily an island of women. And the number 9, where it does crop up in those sorts of contexts, it's usually a sisterhood rather than a brotherhood or a mixed gender association. So 9 is more associated with women, and as numerous people have pointed out over the years, this could be due to the idea of human pregnancies lasting roughly 9 months. So the mother is bearing a child for 9 cycles of the moon. Roughly, I know obviously some children come early, some come late, but roughly 9 months. So the perhaps that lunar context, the number 9 became primarily associated with women and the motherhood, particularly the powers of motherhood. So there may be an element of that going on. Now, also within Celtic traditions, and this particularly associates with the hazel tree itself, which is what Cool means, you have accounts of sacred pools. And in the sacred pool, there's both Welsh versions of this, Irish versions of this, and so forth. The salmon of wisdom dwells, and the salmon of wisdom is not just any old fish. The salmon is this magical, phenomenally long-lived fish. There's various poetic verses in which heroes have to go in search of these ancient magical animals, and they'll encounter an animal like a stag, for example, and the stag, in one particular story that I'm thinking of, where they're trying to find a lost child, Mabon, and even though this child is a child, he's a young boy, they go to this ancient animal who's lived hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years and say to him, do you know where the Mabon is? And he says, oh no, I don't, but there's another animal further down the road who's many, many times older than I am, they might remember. And on it goes through a list of older and older and older animals, the oldest of which is the salmon of wisdom. And it's only the salmon who is ancient enough, thousands and thousands and thousands of years old, who can remember where Mabon is, and has seen Mabon being imprisoned in a castle that's directly next to a river, and the salmon, a huge, great big salmon, magic-sized salmon, swims up the river, taking the heroes with it, and takes them to where the boy is imprisoned in the tower. So despite the boy clearly being at least as old as the salmon, he doesn't age. He remains an eternal youth, an eternal child, rather than growing up and growing old. So a little bit of a kind of Peter Pan type of a figure, perhaps the eternal child. But the pool, getting back to the number imagery, in which the salmon of wisdom mostly lives, even though occasionally it's obviously swimming up rivers and adventuring further forth, but the pool in which it primarily lives is surrounded by hazel trees, and in quite a lot of traditions it's 9 hazel trees, very specifically 9 hazel trees, and the branches droop over the pool of water and drop their nuts, their hazelnuts, into the water, and the fish, as well as whatever else it might eat, consumes the nuts from the sacred hazel trees. And this is why the salmon of wisdom is wise, because it has absorbed wisdom and knowledge from the nuts of the 9 magical trees. And so the Ogham letter of Coll is very much associated with the notion of wisdom and knowledge, and particularly ancient wisdoms, ancestral wisdoms passed down from generation to generation to generation, that people acquire through study and learning and so forth. So it's not just being wise as in a little bit canny, insightful, but it is being wise in the sense of being in possession and understanding this significant body of knowledge and law. Very much perhaps the image of the sort of stereotyped ancient druid of the distant past, this wise old man or wise old woman who possessed this immense body of knowledge handed down from countless generations of druids going back to the year dot. So it's the absorption of wisdom and the absorption of knowledge. And in a number of traditions, such as the story of Finn McCall, of course his surname, Coll, the hazel tree, Finn, son of the hazel tree, because his father is named after the hazel tree. As a young lad, kind of late childhood, early teens, he goes off to study under an ancient druid in the woods, Finnegas. And the druid has spent years trying to catch the salmon of wisdom so he can eat it and absorb all the knowledge of the salmon. So the salmon eats the nuts and gets the knowledge from the hazel trees, and then the druid wants to eat the salmon so he can get the knowledge from the salmon, do it that way. And it's one of those, a little bit like that children's song about the old woman who swallowed a spider that wriggled and wriggled and wriggled inside her, and she eats one thing after another after another. It's this kind of succession of eating, consuming to gain knowledge and wisdom, which as an idea, branching off a little bit here into slightly peculiar territory, but there's a whole body of law around the notion of eating in different religious traditions from around the world, both ancient and contemporary surviving religious traditions. In some cultures, the sacred thing is consumed. And that's how you know it's sacred, because you go and eat it, because it's the thing you want to eat. So obviously within Catholicism you've got the transubstantiation, the consumption of the body and the blood of Christ, so that you take, symbolically through the wine and the wafer, you take the most holy being, Christ himself, into you by eating him and drinking the wine. The consumption of the Holy One. And undoubtedly it's a two-way street, because just as if you take Christ into yourself, so Christ takes you into him, so he eats you as such. That sounds a bit weird, doesn't it? But he partakes of the person who partakes of him. So it's a two-way street, and that as an idea is consistent with many of the cultures in which obviously not Christ, but maybe a sacred animal, a totem animal, a holy revered being is eaten, so that the person, or usually the tribe, doing the eating, not only do they take the power of the magic being into themselves, but the magic being in question also takes the members of the tribe into it. So again, it's that sort of two-way exchange, two-way street. There are other cultures in which you definitely do not eat the sacred being. In fact, it would be considered offensive and blasphemous and outrageous and what have you, if you were to go and eat the most holy thing. You kind of admire it from afar, you don't kill it and eat it, whereas in some cultures you do kill it and eat it. So two quite different approaches to this notion of whether or not you should consume the holy thing. If you want to get really quite rancid and ghoulish, they're in some parts of the world. This extends not only to sacred animals, but to particular revered humans. It may be a an enemy you have defeated in battle who was very brave and very fierce, and it was a close run battle, and finally you kill your enemy, and part of the toasting the fact that you survived and they didn't is to consume part of them, very rarely all of them, because obviously it's a hell of a lot of meat in a human being, you want to eat the whole thing. But in some cultures it's eating the heart of the fallen enemy, or other bodily parts in other cultures, or the hunter who brings down the very difficult sacred deer, buffalo, whatever the creature may be, often gets the first bite of the meat. That's part of the kind of the ritual act, that having brought this fierce, brave beast down that was difficult to capture and kill, the consumption, the first ritualistic consumption, the first mouthful, goes to the hunter rather than the king or the chieftain or some other terribly important person. It goes to the hunter. So there are different traditions around this act of consumption, whether it's the fish eating the nuts, or Finnegas, the old druid, wanting to eat the salmon itself. Now, in the story of Finn McCall, at this juncture in time, he's not actually called Finn yet. He doesn't get that name till the end of the story. He acts as a student of the druid. He is an assistant. He's fetching water and cooking his food and probably ironing his shirts and doing whatever else for him, as well as studying as a pupil. He assists with the old man trying to catch the fish. They eventually do catch the fish, reel it in with the fishing rod, and the druid puts the salmon on a spit, and he's cooking it over a campfire, ready to scoff it and absorb all of the wisdom and the knowledge of the salmon. And obviously with the heat of the cooking, the skin of the salmon blisters and burns, and some of the juices spurt out and land on the thumb of the little boy who is assisting him, who does what anyone would do if something scalding hot landed on them. He goes, and sticks his thumb in his mouth and sucks it, and so he consumes the juices, the first bite, as it were, of the sacred salmon. And old Finnegas chucks up his hands in the air and goes, has a bit of a moan and grumble, and says, well, clearly the gods mean this salmon for you, even though I've been sitting here for years on end trying to capture this fish, and you've been here 5 minutes as my assistant. The first taste has gone to you. Therefore, this is an omen. This is what the gods want. You must eat the salmon. And the boy goes, oh, no, no, no. And the druid says, oh, yes, 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 yes. And eventually, long story short, the kid eats the salmon, and he absorbs all the wisdom, the knowledge, the magic, the power of the salmon. Very similar to the story of Taliesin in Wales, who, again, through a whole series of attempted consumptions where a predator animal tries to eat a prey animal through a succession of shape-shifting processes, eventually at the end of the story, Taliesin, well, he's not called Taliesin then, again, it's a name issue, it's Guillaume Bach. At this juncture in the story, he tries to escape the witch Ceridwen by transforming himself into a grain of corn and falling on the floor of the threshing house with Auntie 1,000 other grains of corn, and she turns into a chicken, a hen, and pecks it all up and eats it, and eats him along with all of the other grains. And I suppose he dies in a sense, he is digested, but she then becomes pregnant, and the child she gives birth to 9 months down the line is this magical baby boy with light halo glowing off him, and she pushes the boy in a leather sack out on the river, and it's carried down to protect him from his older brother, who is consumed with jealousy. And eventually the boy is found by Prince Gwythnogoranhir, who's out fishing for salmon in the salmon weir, and he reels in this sack and he opens it up, and there's this baby giggling and gurgling at him, and he says that the radiant light sparkling off the brow of the baby, we shall call him Taliesin, radiant browed. So again, having gone through this process of consumption, in his case getting eaten rather than doing the eating, he then gets a new name and is reborn as a new person, just as the boy in Irish myth is reborn as Finn, which is the name he acquires after eating the fish, because just as I should have said at the start of the story of Guyon Bach, what causes the witch to want to chase after him in the first place and eat him is that she has been brewing a potion, the Arwen, for a year and a day, and he has been an assistant, just like Demna, the Irish boy, stirring the cauldron and putting wood on the fire and all the rest of it. The potion is meant for Ceridwen's ugly son, Avagthi, and as a kind of a compensation for his ugliness, to give him immense wisdom. This is the potion of wisdom, the Arwen. Right at the end, when the cauldron has gone white hot and the potion is just ready to drink, the cauldron explodes, 3 drops of the liquid fly up into the air and land on the fingers of Guyon Bach, and again he does exactly what Demna does and puts his fingers in his mouth and without thinking absorbs the potion, gains all the wisdom and the magic and the knowledge and the power. So the potion is filled with wisdom and the power to shapeshift and all sorts of magical skills to be imparted to the drinker, just as the salmon of wisdom is filled with all this wonderful knowledge and magical power and what have you that gets imparted to the person who eats the salmon, consumes the salmon. So whether it's the magic Arwen potion, whether it's the magic salmon, you've got stories in which the assistant, the young lad, not the main magical figure, the wise old Whatsit, but the young lad, a little bit Jungian there, the balance between the Senex, the old wise one, and the pure, the boy, the youth, the young one, exists as this dual dichotomy. The potion or the magic salmon goes to the lad. He gains all of the wisdom. The key difference, of course, being that Ceridwen wants to kill the little bugger, having got the magic, whereas old Finicus, aside from having a bit of a mumble and a grumble, he goes, but you eat it. He doesn't try and kill the boy, at least not in the version of the story that survived, at any rate. But both have this element of gaining of wisdom, gaining of knowledge. Hazel trees do not appear in the story of Ceridwen and Taliesin. Well, not in the surviving version. Maybe there was an older version in which they did, who knows, but not in the surviving version. But they do appear in connection with the salmon of wisdom. So both the hazel tree itself, its magical nuts dropping into the water, and the salmon, the sacred fish that eats those nuts, consumes the knowledge from the tree by eating the nuts. So it's passing on the tradition. So also worth thinking, of course, hazelnuts and knowledge, that it's a very late surviving tradition into the Victorian age. Edwardian fortune-telling books have mention of it, so probably still people do it to this very day, I'm quite sure. A tradition at Christmas time, midwinter, in which somebody would get a shovel, metal shovel, a little coal shovel, and put hazelnuts, and often each hazelnut would have painted or scratched into its shell a letter of the alphabet, and so there'd be a nut for A, a nut for B, a nut for C, so on. Put them onto the shovel, put the shovel on the hot coals or hot logs if it was a wood fire, the embers into the fireplace, and whichever nut cracks first in the heat, that nut or the letter on it is usually taken to be the initial letter of the name of the person that you will marry. So it's a little bit of a romantic fortune-telling thing. So to gain the knowledge of the future, and obviously there's a world of difference between sacred magical salmon giving you mystical power and finding out if you're going to marry somebody called Fred or Harry or Albert or whatever. But there is a sort of a continuity of the theme of knowledge and the theme of magic. The divination is magical, and there is an imparting of knowledge, albeit in a very small scale kind of a way, to the person using the hazelnuts. And of course a link to the idea of the alphabet, for that matter. There are some traditions in which instead of letters of the alphabet, the girl or boy would say, well, this nut is for Mary next door, and this nut is for Gladys who lives down the lane, and this nut is for someone else and someone else and someone else. So rather than letters, they're putting one nut per person that they know whom they might potentially marry, and then whichever one cracks first is the one they're destined to marry. So quite a late surviving practice there, and I'm sure you could do it in other things, not just to find out who you're going to marry. You could use it to find out any number of things. We've mentioned in previous recordings the idea of the colour Ogham, Ogham, whichever you prefer to say, for the letter C rather. It's cron, and cron is a brownish reddish colour, which I visualise as the colour of a hazelnut. That kind of slightly reddy brown colour that the hazelnut goes. That's cron, which is fairly straightforward. I can't think off the top of my head of any specific mentions in poetry or mythology to someone who is described as having cron hair or wearing a cron cloak or anything like that, so I can't link it to specific characters who are overtly linked to that colour. The profession Ogham is Cruterect, the harpist, the player of the harp. Now, harps do crop up quite a bit in various Celtic myths, most famous one being the Dugdar's harp, which can play songs to make you weep with sadness, songs to make you fall into a deep sleep, lullabies, and songs to make you laugh, bawdy, rude songs. And it has the power of turning the seasons as well, and causing spring to turn to summer and summer to turn to autumn and to winter and so forth. Now the harp of the Dugdar is referred to as being made out of oak wood rather than out of hazel wood. So it's a little unusual that the harp is associated with this tree and not with Dure, the oak tree, one of the preceding letters, 2 letters back in fact in the alphabet. But for whatever reason it is associated with this letter instead, which you could maybe take to indicate a variety of things if you're engaging in divination and contemplating and issues, and this letter comes out. It could refer to learning, wisdom, knowledge, study, enrolling in a course, studying a subject, that sort of thing, tapping into your ancient ancestral knowledge of some subject, whatever's available to you. It could refer to a particular tutor, a wise old whatsit who comes into your life to teach and to guide. Perhaps in terms of sources of knowledge, like the Salmon of Wisdom, we could take it to be a reference to needing to go back to source. You want to know the nature of something, or the truth about an issue, go to the source. Go to the horse's mouth, go to the salmon, go to the roots of the tree, or whatever other metaphor you want to use. Go to where it all begins. And if you want to pick up on that imagery of eating the sacred thing, maybe what you need to do is absorb the knowledge, take it inside yourself, digest it, think about it. Don't just skim read. Take it in deep and let it change you. Let it become part of you. In terms of that harp imagery, I suppose that maybe a reminder that life isn't all book learning and hard study. It's time to listen to music, to relax, to kick back, to allow the music to flow through you, the joy of life, to celebrate. Partying, not necessarily in the sense of getting wildly drunk and dancing naked on tables, but to enjoy cultural things like music, maybe art, maybe other things, that restore the soul, restore the weary soul. So take time out for those things as well, not just, perhaps there's a good message for overwrought students. It's not all just study. There's got to be room for other things as well, pleasures, as well as hard study. In terms of the word Ogham, the Briar Ogham, we got several references. One is the fairest of trees, owing to its beauty in the woods. And hazel trees are very nice to look at. Well, all trees, I think, well, pretty much all trees are nice to look at, but that hazel tree is seen as particularly fair, particularly pleasant. So perhaps a reference to fairness, gentleness, goodness, kindness, not necessarily outward beauty. Doesn't necessarily mean you're going to meet a tall, dark stranger or a short, beautiful stranger or whatever. But to be of good temperament, of good nature, the tree as a purveyor of wisdom and knowledge and nurture is a benevolent tree. Fairness in that sense, perhaps, as well as potentially physical beauty. Another is friend of cracking. Both those I've just mentioned, that you're putting the nuts on the shovel to let it crack. The nuts can be cracked in the process of ritual magic and so on. But also, of course, if you want to eat the hazelnut in the first place, you've got to crack the shell. So, hazelnuts were extensively used, not only to eat them as they are, as a snack, but to grind them up, to make nut flour, to make bread and cakes and things like that. Going way back to prehistoric times, there have been caves and dwelling places where archaeologists have found all manner of animal bones and what have you from cooking for dinner, and mountains of cracked hazelnut shells where clearly people have been eating a hell of a lot of hazelnuts as part of a staple diet. So they are a reliable staple, not just for squirrels but for humans. Back in the day when maybe, obviously foraging was a much more prominent part of daily survival. So friend of cracking is cracking nuts. To how can we put this into a divinatory context? Sometimes you might see something that looks hard as a nutshell. And if it looks hard and you're not much one for hard work, you might think, oh no, it's too hard, I can't be bothered with this, and move on to the next thing. Whereas perhaps this is a reminder that sometimes you've got to crack through the outer shell, you've got to tackle the hard obstacle to get to the nut within, to get to the source of goodness and wisdom and knowledge and what have you. Whether that's reading a really difficult, challenging book to try and understand what it's on about, whether that is acquiring some difficult skill in order to gain the benefit of it, possibly even in a sort of relationship or friendship context. Some people might have obviously a bit of a tough outer shell, which can be off-putting, and they may be quite difficult to know. Rather grim and forbidding at times and not very friendly, but perhaps if you persist, you crack through that outer casing, then you get to the nice, sweet person within. Could be taken in that context. The other is fair wood, sweetest tree. Again, sweetest reference to the nuts, but also to the kind temperament of the tree, perhaps in that context. So just a generally benevolent presence that crops up in a whole variety of contexts. Now, previous ones we've mentioned the bird Ogham. The listings given, they seem to skip the letter C and go to the letter Q, the last of this set of 5 in the Echma. Now that could be because whoever was writing, whatever monk was writing the manuscript, they were distracted, they'd had a few beers, who knows what, and they accidentally missed the letter C, and whichever bird went with the letter C. It may be they just didn't know in the first place that wherever they were gaining the information from, copying it from another book, or listening to someone dictate information and writing it down, or whatever they may have been doing, the source didn't know the letter C, so they just skipped it. Or it may be that the bird for the letter C and the bird for the letter Q, C and Q quite similar as phonetic sounds, were deemed sufficiently similar that they were one and the same thing. Possibly. I won't go into a great long thing about it, because when I record the next letter, Quert, we'll go over the bird then, which is Querch, which means a hen, chicken. But I mention it briefly here because, of course, I've just told you a little while ago the bit about Cenedwen in Welsh myth turning into a chicken in order to pick up all of the grain and eat, Gwion Bach, as he's called at that point in the story, eat the boy who has turned himself into a piece of grain. So there is a sort of a link to chickens, a link to hens for the Hazel, for Cool, as well as perhaps a more solid link to the next letter. But we'll go over that more with the next letter. Going back to the number 9, I forgot to mention also in Welsh sources the flower maiden Blodeuwedd is composed out of flowers, and in some versions of the story she's composed from 9 flowers that are cast into a cauldron and mixed up by Math, Mathfonwy and Gwydion, 2 great wizards, who then from the steam and the bubbling potion within the cauldron, there emerges Blodeuwedd, the flower maiden. So the number 9 there does crop up there too, as being the 9 flower elements from which she is made. Just as in the Scottish and other Gaelic sources, you've got the 9 natural elements as references to things that the world is made out of. And there is a story from within a Christian manuscript of the world being made from Adam, as in Adam and Eve, Adam, and the 9 bits of him, the blood, the bones, the hair, and so forth, helping to shape, so the blood becomes the rivers and the bones become the mountains and so on. As a story, it echoes back to quite a number of pagan traditions, Chinese myth, Norse myth and so on, in which a giant dies and is chopped up, and this bit of the giant becomes mountains, and that bit of the giant becomes forests, and some other bit of the giant becomes something else. And essentially the whole world is made out of the body parts of a chopped up giant. And not just a kind of average sized giant, but like a cosmic mega giant, which you can take as just a mad story if you want, or you could take it more metaphorically to suggest underpinning this idea is that everything which exists ultimately is of the same substance, ultimately came from the same source, the primal being, the first thing. And it's only through the division of that first thing, that first primal source of everything, that we now exist in a universe where everything looks different. Mountains are noticeably different from rivers, are noticeably different from forests, are noticeably different from swamps. But you could say, in a sense, all matter, everything that exists metaphorically goes back to the same primal soup, the same primal source of everything. Which I think is probably what that was getting at, and I suspect the manuscript which talks about Adam in this context is basing itself on a much older story and has just changed the name of whatever that being was called in the first version of the story to Adam, to sort of bring it within a Christian context. Harmonise it with the changes of theology. So there is, again, that notion of the everything from which things are made. Perhaps connecting to Cool as a reflection that there's this sort of primal source, and the salmon, just as the salmon, when it's mating, swims back to its river or pool or whatever of origin, it goes back to its source in order to produce the next generation of salmon. So we have to go back to source, we have to go back to where everything comes from in order to understand it. And having seen where it comes from, we then understand the bigger picture in a greater degree of insight and complexity. There is the figure of Coll himself, Finn's father. Finn never really knows his father. His father dies whilst his mother is pregnant and she has to go into hiding. So he's not a well-detailed figure about whom a massive amount can be said. There's also another figure of Macul, one of the 3 brothers, the son of the Hazel, the son of the plough, Machecht, and can't remember what the other one was. Magrunia, son of the sun. I need to double check. I should have checked before starting this recording, shouldn't I? Rather than relying on memory. But they're seen as the sort of three early gods of ancient Ireland, three ancient figures. So the son of Mechecht, the son of the plough, perhaps as presumably a patron figure of agriculture, and maybe by contrast his brother Coll, son of the tree, a son of the hazel tree, was a deity of the forests. So untilled, untamed land versus agricultural and the tilled and the tamed land. So a bit of a contrast between two of the three brothers going on there, perhaps. And so could we see Coll as the hazel tree as a reference to the untamed, and again going back to that idea of foraging for nuts, that whilst farmland, tilled land, is obviously pasture land for animals, are sources of sustenance, human maintained land, we also gain sustenance from the wild, the untouched, the untamed. And so this letter, the 9th letter, is maybe a representation of that which has not been fiddled with by human ingenuity, has not been made to comply to human needs, but is nonetheless a source of wise and wonderful and nutritious, mentally, physically nutritious things for those who are prepared to go to the source, to journey into the deep woods and find the pool in which the salmon swims, around which the 9 hazel trees grow. Perhaps. But I think that's enough waffle for this one. I'll leave it here, and I'll try and crack on with the rest of the recordings over the near future rather than leave another massive gap before doing the rest. Thank you.